Chapter 9. The Life of Rabbi Jesus. The Prophet Steps Out. Christ Jesus ben Pantera trained as a rabbi in the school of Rabbi Hillel, Codex of Hillel, who was the most famous Pharisee of the early 1st century. Rabbi Hillel taught his students to seek peace, love all creatures, and bring them closer to the Torah. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Rabbi Jesus was a man of pristine virtue and severity, much devoted to the maintenance of the law of Moses, carried in the Torah. It is important to remember that Rabbi Jesus was raised by the Essenes and taught the faith of the Jewish people in some of the 480 synagogues said to have been in the area at the time. Luke 4:44. To play down the importance of the title Rabbi given to Jesus in older testaments, some newer editions replace the original word with the less controversial teacher. However, Rabbi was used in the oldest and most reliable texts of the New Testament and was spelt with a capital R. Like Judas Christus, Rabbi Jesus received his religious education into the secret order of the Essenes Initiates, and the records of antiquity reveal that they were associated with affiliated communities. Those records also insisted that Jesus spent time as a youth in Druidic communities in Britain, and he was there with Joseph of Arimathea. Regarding British written records, the whole of Britain's history for the first 500 years of the Christian age is almost entirely blank. Gildas, the first British historian, lived between 516 and 570, but we also glean a few scattered scraps of information from Taliesin, the Welsh prince bard and authority on matters Druidical. However, there are 4 separate and entirely independent traditions that present a consecutive story about Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus, and Lazarus traveling regularly to and from Britain. The first was found in Cornwall and was recorded in Baring Gould, Book of Cornwall. He said that another Cornish story is to the effect that Joseph of Arimathea came in a boat to Cornwall and brought the boy Jesus with him, and later taught him how to extract tin and purge it from its wolfram. When the tin is flashed, then the tinner shouts. Joseph was in the trade. From the earliest times, the British tin miners called him Joseph de Marmor of Arimathea. Mar was an Eastern word for Lord, and Mor signified great. The interpretation of Joseph's title in this example was the Great Lord Joseph of Arimathea. Curiously, in some ancient writings, he was also called Joseph of Abaramasi. The second and third traditions were found in Somerset and provided descriptions of Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus sojourning to a place called Paradise. A letter signed Glastonbury in the Central Somerset Gazette on 7 August 1936 informed that Paradise was also the ancient Celtic Glastonbury, but the writer does not give his or her authority for the statement. It was also said that Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus often stayed at Somerset village of Priddy on top of the Mendip Hills. The records of Geoffrey of Monmouth stated that Jesus' grandfather, Roman Emperor Augustus, equipped him with weapons for the journey from Rome, and this reference placed Jesus in Britain at least once before the age of 23, for Augustus died in the year 14. It was significant that all 4 traditions are entirely independent but are synchronically achievable, and it was equally significant that no tradition existed in Devonshire. The name British was derived from 2 words in the ancient Hebrew language, brith meaning covenant and ish meaning a man or woman. Joined as one word, British meant covenant man or woman, and the Druids considered themselves Covenanters, like the Essenes. An argument in favor of these traditions was that the continental Essenes sent their neophyte priests to auxiliary branches in Britain to undergo special training at the hands of Druid priests, and Jesus was one of them. The Essene doctrine was so closely associated with Druidism that its origin may be said to have been Druidic, and the Druids' beliefs were the same as those entertained by the Essenes. From a close study of their religious beliefs, everything points to the fact that the Cimmerians, ancestors of the Celts, held fast to the patriarchal faith of the Old Testament, and so did the Essenes. The Essenes maintained mainly secluded communities throughout the whole of the Roman-occupied territory, and in every town the order had its respective house. Except when toiling in the fields, they dressed invariably in white linen robes. They cultivated obedience, truthfulness, continence, justice, and temperance. The initiated members ate alone. They laid claim to magical powers and the ability to predict. It is enough to say that between Essenism in certain aspects and Christianity, there are some points of resemblance. They were a very numerous sect, and Pliny and Philo estimated their numbers at 4,000 in the Palestine area alone during the 1st century. They were famous not only as religious teachers of the law of Moses, but were especially noted for their vast knowledge of herbal medicines. Josephus recorded that they have a profound knowledge of the art of healing and study it arduously. They examine herbs and plants which they prepare as medicine for man and beasts. They also know the use and worth of minerals as medicines, and do a great deal of good by applying these for healing the sick. Josephus said that many of the Essenes have often stepped forth among the people as healers and prophets, and because of their knowledge of natural therapies, they became known as the therapeutae, the healers, the ones who laid their hands upon, applying their herbal ointments. This was part of the role of the pious Rabbi Jesus, and many examples of his well-meaning can be found in the New Testament. Before his official dispatch into the world as a prophet, he was baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. Baptism, or the application of water, was a rite well known to the general community before the time of the Gospels, and, according to Reverend J.P. Lundy, was introduced sometime after the Babylonian captivity, 397 B.C. The Essenes purified themselves frequently using a ceremony common to many earlier religions. Once they were made clean from some supposed pollution or defilement, they hated to be touched by anybody. Extreme importance was attached to ceremonial purity, and they followed scrupulously the prescriptions against Levitical defilements. Even for a junior to touch a senior was pollution to the latter. There are references in the New Testament to Rabbi Jesus resisting being touched. "Do not touch me," he said in the Gospel of Mark. It is worth noting the so-called Messianic rule found among the Dead Sea Scrolls recorded all male members of their community were, at the age of 30 years, regarded as mature and ready to serve the public. The New Testament revealed Rabbi Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age. Luke 3:23. In the canonical Mark and John Gospels, the original Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel, and the earliest Luke Gospel, it was at this age that Rabbi Jesus' story began, and at this time he would have been a married man. 18 years is the age of the nuptial canopy, says the rabbinical text on the stages of life. Jesus' first 2 wives. From information given in the Gospels, it was clear that Rabbi Jesus was married. The Jewish record stated that he was a rabbi teaching and living the religious beliefs of the law of Moses, which provided for marriage. In fact, it was quite proper within that law for Rabbi Jesus to have had several wives at the same time. Noah's father, Lamech, being the first polygamist recorded in the Bible. The belief that Jesus was married was supported by his title Rabbi, a term that translates as my master. Jesus was called Rabbi 13 times in the New Testament, and therefore he had to be married, for the Jewish Mishnaic law of the time specifically stated an unmarried man may not be a rabbi. From information recorded in old church writings and other ancient texts, it was possible to determine that Rabbi Jesus was married 3 times. His first wife was Princess Cyprus, a Nabatean Arab and daughter of Cyprus and Alexas. Cyprus was also her mother's name, and she was King Harold's granddaughter. Rabbi Jesus' first wife was not mentioned by name in the New Testament, but was recorded in the family tree of King Harold. Her uncle was Joseph of Arimathea, who was also the brother of Berenice, the mother of Miriam, Harold, and Herodias. Rabbi Jesus and Princess Cyprus had 5 children, 3 boys, Adamanus, Guiderius, Caradoc, and 2 girls, Urgain and Gladys. Rabbi Jesus' marriage to Princess Cyprus was indirectly responsible for the establishment of Christianity today. To determine when, where, and how they met is now almost impossible to establish. There was no documentary church evidence available to assist in providing more detail on this marriage, nor should we expect to find it. But once the true name of Jesus Christ was known, it was possible to establish the historicity of the union. Under rabbinic law, it seems certain that Rabbi Jesus was married at or before the age of 18, and this being so, he and Princess Cyprus would most probably have lived with one of the Essene sects that Josephus said accepted marriage. The importance of the part played in world history by the children of their marriage will become apparent as the story unfolds. There is much to be said about Rabbi Jesus' second wife, Mary Magdalene, and support that he was romantically involved with her commenced with some Gospels suppressed early in church history. In the Gospel of Mary, for example, was recorded that Rabbi Jesus loved Mary Magdalene, while the Gospel of Philip said he used to kiss her often on the mouth. In an ancient undated writing found by Reverend W.D. Mahon in the St. Sophia Mosque at Constantinople in 1883, was told the story of an old man who lived on the road to Bethany, who once had been a rabbi, a man of great learning and well skilled in the law of Moses, and that Jesus was often there with him reading the law, that his name was not Massalian, and that I might find Jesus there with him. But he was not there. Massalian said he was often at Bethany with his family, and he thought there was some love affair between him and one of the girls. I asked him if he had seen anything like a courtship between them. He said he had not, but inferred from their intimacy and from his fondness on the woman's part, as well as from the laws of nature, that such would be the case. Mary Magdalene was portrayed throughout the Gospel stories in the constant presence of Rabbi Jesus and as a leader. All 4 Gospel accounts mention her first when speaking of the group of 12 women associated with the story of Rabbi Jesus. In the Byzantine Chronicles, she was recorded to have been in Rome with Rabbi Jesus at the time of the trial of Judas Christus. The records showed she played a leading role in his life. In fact, Mary Magdalene and the other ladies financed the ministry of Rabbi Jesus. Luke 8:3. Nowhere in the Gospels of the New Testament does it say that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. More importantly, the only detrimental gospel statement regarding Mary Magdalene's reputation was carried in 4th century interpolations that make up the last 12 verses at the end of Mark's Gospel today, but are not in the earliest New Testaments currently available. For that reason, most modern Bibles delete these narratives or index them to a special footnote, advising readers that they were later interpolations into the Bible. So why did the early church prevent further investigation into Mary Magdalene's activities, and why did it wish her discredited in this fashion? The well-established Christian image of Mary Magdalene as a prostitute is a slander not based on fact, and like so many other stories inspired by a censorious church, has long been proved nonsense. Despite all attempts by Christian historians to cast her as a redeemed prostitute, there is no external or gospel evidence to that effect. So who really was Mary Magdalene? The most difficult question in Bible history. The Roman Catholic Church has always denied that Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin Mary, was anything but a virgin, or that she had other children. However, the Gospels recorded that she had 7 children, and the quality of the evidence to dispute the Church claim is relevant to Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mark 6:3 and Matthew 13:55 claimed James the younger, Joseph in some translations, Judas, Thomas, and Simon were the sons of Virgin Mary, and therefore the brothers of Rabbi Jesus. In other areas of the Mark Gospel 3:18 and the Matthew Gospel 10:3, the authors advised James the Younger was the son of Philip, Herod, which implied Virgin Mary had children by a second husband. On this matter, Smith's Bible Dictionary admitted that this is one of the most difficult questions in Bible history. The Gospels also stated that Rabbi Jesus had sisters, but only one, Solomon, was named. That there was more than one was clearly stated in the Matthew Gospel, 13:56. And when discussing Rabbi Jesus, the author referred to all his sisters. The brothers of Jesus were married, and this chapter shall determine that all his sisters were also married. Just who their husbands were is important in establishing at least one reason why Mary Magdalene was defamed. An ancient church tradition maintained that one of Rabbi Jesus' sisters was named Maria, or as recorded in some early Gospels, Margi. That this Maria, Margi, of Christian tradition was the elusive Mary Magdalene is a conclusion that can be supported. The names of all Rabbi Jesus' sisters can be determined by combining the incomplete gospel documentation with the writings of the early presbyters and the suppressed gospels. But first it is important to clarify a vital gospel statement, which claimed Lazarus and Martha were Mary of Bethany's brothers and sisters. There is a substantial reason for regarding Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene as the same person. The early presbyters, Irenaeus, Quintus Tertullian, and Origen, certainly considered them to be so, as did popular tradition at the end of the 2nd century. Many biblical scholars of today concur. Adding further to the biblical construction of Mary's name, Magdalene came to be taken as meaning from the area of Magdala. Today, Magdala is presented as a wealthy and depraved 1st century Roman holiday resort situated 6 miles south of Capernaum in Galilee, not far from the famous mineral springs at Tiberias. However, in the Gospel of Mark 8:10, Magdala was curiously called Dalmanutha, and this word will shortly be shown to be a secret editorial New Testament cipher revealing a far different location for Magdala. However, had Mary Magdalene moved to Bethany, she would traditionally have been called Mary of Bethany, and this is an important point in determining that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same person. If Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were one and the same person, and the sister of Rabbi Jesus, called Margi or Maria in early church tradition, was Mary from Magdala or Bethany, that made Martha and Lazarus half-brother and sister to Rabbi Jesus. If so, this would have meant the so-called Virgin Mary, Miriam Herod, had 4 paramours and 9 children, including the twins. They were the Roman father, Tiberius Pantera, of Judas and Jesus, the twins, the unnamed father of Joseph and Simon, Philip, Herod, father of James the Younger, and Solomon and Cyrus, the father of Mary, Magdalene, and Bethany, Martha and Lazarus, Gospel of James. Mary Magdalene's name was again found in documentation first published in Latin in 1275, entitled the Golden Legend, which was compiled from a variety of early Gospels by the Bishop of Genoa, Jacobus de Voragine, 1230 to 1298. Whatever its substance, the Golden Legend emanated from a very early source, and importantly, for what is being established here, recorded Lazarus and Martha were Mary Magdalene's brother and sister. The Canonical Gospel of John 11:5 stated Rabbi Jesus loved Martha and her sister, Mary of Bethany, nay, Mary Magdalene, and Lazarus. The Golden Legend also provided a reference drawn from the 2nd century Gospel of James that stated Mary Magdalene was actually a woman of noble birth. A 15th century English translation of this work said, Mary, Eucharist Magdalene, had her surname of Magdala, a castle, and was born of right noble lineage, and her parents, which were descendants of the lineage of kings, and her father was named Cyrus, and her mother also Mary, Miriam Herald, Eucharist. Both Mary Magdalene and her mother's middle names are strikingly similar to the central act of Christian worship, the Eucharist, and the suspicion was that the ancient rites were conducted by those two women, and the ceremonies became known as the Eucharist. There is ever fascination to be found in a name, and that of Mary Magdalene is no exception. It seldom fails to intrigue the mind, creating a curious desire to learn what it may mean and how it was derived. In names as shown in herein, invariably is found the key that unlocks the door to an age-old mystery. At the time of the 1st century, the Roman words for castle on a hill were Margi Divinum. Here then we see the origin of the name Margi Magdalenum, found in some old Gospels. It derived from Margi, from the castle Magdala, and supported the Gospel of James' reference to the royal status of Mary Magdalene. The name Margi Magdala subsequently evolved to Maria, Mary Magdalene, in centuries of translation variations. Whatever Berenger Soignier discovered at Rennes-le-Château was a secret directly associated with Mary Magdalene, and the castle-like constructions he built and called Bethany and Magdala seem to point to the fact that he knew the royal nature of Mary Magdalene and the real location of the Magdala Castle. The renaming of Magdala to Dalmanutha in the Gospel of Mark provided a vital clue in establishing the real location of Magdala. The Church extended the opinion that Dalmanthua in Mark's Gospel might be a corruption of Dalmantius, who was a nephew of Constantine the Great. This was a curious statement, for the Church claimed the Gospel of Mark was written 300 years before the time of Constantine. The knowledge that Sir Francis Bacon coded secret information into the Bible provided a more supportable solution and led to an examination of ancient maps. The word Dalmanthua was a modern translation variation of Dalmatia, sometimes also interpreted Dalmatia. It was an area of Britain in South Wales, and then bounded on the south by the sea called Severn, and on the west by the Dalmatian Sea. It was here that the able antagonist of Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, King Caswallon I, had his castle Magdala. Upon the death of King Caswallon, his nephew Tenvantius, the son of King Lud and the Duke of Cornwall, became King of Britain. With a multiplicity of names then given to leaders, Tenvantius may also be the person called Adadomarius in the records of that period. It was also possible that he adopted the title Caswallon II, for this person was recorded in one old record as the father of Lazarus. If he was the father of Lazarus, he was also the father of Martha and Mary Magdalene. The name Tenvantius, however, was an ancient variation of Cyrus, recorded in the Gospel of James, a being of descendant of the lineage of kings, father of Mary Magdalene, Martha, and Lazarus, and all born of right noble lineage. Mary Magdalene's father was King of Britain, and she was a Celtic priestess, and probably a Druid priestess. Prince Lazarus and Princess Martha, Mary Magdalene's brother and sister, were also royal Celts and half-brother and sisters of Rabbi Jesus. Documented twice in the Bible was the tradition that accepted incest to be approved by God. Moses' parents, for example, were made to be nephew and aunt, Genesis 6:20, and Abraham clearly stated Sarah was the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife, Genesis 20:12. Therefore, under the biblical law of Moses, it was quite proper and correct for Rabbi Jesus to have married his half-sister, Princess Mary Magdalene, and lived with her and several other wives at the same time. This may be the reason why the later church tried to disassociate Rabbi Jesus from Princess Mary Magdalene, who, in this premise, was the Virgin Mary's daughter from another marriage. Similar to his first marriage to Princess Cyprus, it was possible that it was an arranged royal marriage, as was the well-established practice of the time. The New Testament clearly substantiated the practice of marrying one's sister. We have authority to lead about a sister as a wife, even as the followers and the Lord's brothers and Cephas do we not. This narrative clearly stated two of Rabbi Jesus' brothers were married to their remaining sisters, Martha and Solomon. If this narrative presented a correct picture of what the author originally conceived, it showed a tradition of regal family intermarrying. What was generally believed the story of a woman called Mary of Egypt was later adopted and applied to Mary Magdalene as the gospel stories evolved. Mary of Egypt was a 3rd century prostitute from Alexandria who solicited business among the pilgrims en route to Jerusalem. Subsequently, she gave up her whore's life, became very devout, and lived as a female hermit in the Syrian desert. She was later canonized for her alleged miracle of walking across the waters of the Jordan to take Holy Communion. The possibility that the Church's Jesus Christ was married many times and fathered numerous children causes Christian believers to react with utter horror. The Church defense for such a suggestion was to point out the lack of documentation in the Gospels that specifically said Rabbi Jesus was married. Just as relevant, there was no statement in the Gospels that said Jesus was not married either. In fact, there was a deathly silence throughout the New Testament regarding Rabbi Jesus' marital status. Morton Smith, professor of ancient history at Columbia University, USA, found a document in the Mar Saba Monastery near Jerusalem in 1958 revealing evidence that Rabbi Jesus' marriage were deliberately removed from the Gospels by church decree at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 553. The numerous connotations and indirect references in the current version of the Gospels, however, strongly suggested the authors were under the firm impression that Rabbi Jesus was married. Whether the wedding ceremony only found in the Gospel of John was actually one of Rabbi Jesus's could be discussed until the cows come home, but it probably was. Sex was clearly encouraged by the God of the Old Testament, particularly for recreational purposes, and Rabbi Jesus and Judas Christus did not make celibacy a prerequisite when commissioning their supporters. Many, if not all, were married. Records established that Simon of Petra married Jatope, who accompanied him everywhere, and fathered at least 2 children, a boy and a girl, while Paul said he had been married but was widowed. In the ancient writings of Clement of Alexandria, 160-16, he noted that the disciple Philip, as well as Simon, brother of Judas Christus and Rabbi Jesus, had married and produced families. Clement's records supported the claims that Rabbi Jesus' brothers married their sisters. In the Gospel of Matthew, Rabbi Jesus himself declared, "A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife." Matthew 19:5. Given the traditions of the time, Rabbi Jesus practiced what he preached. Rabbi Jesus' name change. In the British Chronicles, King Tenvantius was recorded as the father of a man called Cunubeline. The terminology in this application meaning absorbed into the family by marriage. This was a well-established adoptive naming practice of the times. And from information available, it seemed that when Rabbi Jesus married Mary Magdalene, he was given the name Canubeline. The structure of the title, Canubeline, represented spiritual renewal over carnal death. Canu, carnal, death, mortify, Bel, Baal, son, new life, rebirth, and may have been applied to Rabbi Jesus during some form of Celtic initiation. Later historians recorded Canubeline in various languages as Sinfaline, Canfelin, Canubeline, or Canubelinus. But to avoid confusion, we shall call him Rabbi Jesus Canubeline during this period of his life. Rabbi Jesus Canubeline was the Cymbeline of Shakespeare, Act 3, Scene 1, immortalized in the lines, "The lofty cedar, royal Cymbeline, personates thee." We now know this person as Jesus Christ, and the hidden gospel story was parried in Shakespeare's plays. Maybe Sim of Cymbeline was an abbreviated clue to Cymric, the ancient Celtic language, and Beline, we know, meant new life. If so, the name Cymbeline would be a coded Francis Bacon cipher meaning a new life for Rabbi Jesus with the Celts. The name Tassio Vanus was also applied to Rabbi Jesus Canubeline and was supported by the existence of first-century coins, but a person with this name was wholly unknown to history. Tassio Vanus was an applied term only, analogous to the divine Caesar title of the Roman emperors, and was later expressed by various language experts to mean Theomontius, Theoman, and Toma, meaning twin in Aramaic, twin man. The Celtic Tassio Vanus coins directly connected Rabbi Jesus Canubeline with the Caesar line of Rome. Rabbi Jesus Canubeline, with Mary Magdalene, produced another 2 children, and their names, Princess Cadwallader and Princess Polydore, are not recorded in the canonical Gospels. In one New Testament narrative alone, however, the names of 2 of Rabbi Jesus Canubeline's grandchildren are recorded, and they were the inheritors of King Cyrus' ancestral estates in Britain. The commencement of the British Church. The 2 things that strike the investigator of early Christian history are the rarely discussed records of the exodus of the main gospel personalities to Britain after the sale and dispatch of Judas Christus, and the manner in which the Roman Church dismissed the mass departure as insignificant. An ancient church tradition maintained that some primary gospel characters also settled in the southern France area. The evangelization of Gaul has often been attributed to missionaries sent from Rome by Saint Clement, a theory which has inspired a whole series of fallacious narratives and forgeries with which history is encumbered. Most likely, the first missionaries came by sea and touched at Marcellus. The first missionaries were not missionaries in the modern church portrayal of the word. A realistic account of events was recorded in a writing carried in the 11th century manuscript that recorded a cumulative French and British tradition maintaining that after the Roman authorities discovered the fabricated nature of Judas Christus' crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, and members of her family fled from the city of Rome by sea to Marcellus, and some re-established their lives in that area. Tradition also maintained Lazarus and some women and some companions landed in Provence at a place called Santes Marias. From what records were available, everything associated with their departure pointed to haste. Mary Magdalene herself was said to have eventually retired to a hilltop residence at Provence, at a place that came to be later called La Sainte Baume. where she lived for 30 years until her death in 63. At the invitation of certain Druids of high rank, Bishop Eusebius recorded that some of the group passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Isles. They were the founders of the Celtic Church in Britain that preceded the establishment of the Roman Church by about 300 years. While there are many learned minds dating from that era onward that provided a similar record of a curious exodus, there is special advantage in quoting from a most eminent church historian who used Vatican records to compile a 12-volume work called Annales Ecclesiastiae. He was Cardinal Caesar Baronius, 1538-1607, and was considered the most outstanding historian of the Roman Catholic Church. Baronius, who turned down 2 offers to become pope in 1605, confirmed Eusebius's report. In that year the party mentioned was exposed to the sea in a vessel without sails or oars. The vessel drifted finally to Marseilles, and there they were saved. From Marseilles, Joseph of Arimathea and some of his company passed into Britain and there died. This event in British history may come as a surprise to many Christians, but there was substantial church evidence to support the knowledge of the journey and its outcome. In Vatican records, the exiles were called the Bethany group and included not only Joseph of Arimathea, but Martial and Trophanius. The recognitions of Clement recorded that the family of Joseph, his servants, and 12 others, including Zacharias, father of John the Baptist, were included in the journey. Zacharias stopped at a place called Rocamadour. Joseph and his household continued on their way to Morlaix in Brittany, there to wait for suitable weather conditions to cross to Britain. 4 days' sail. Joseph of Arimathea's move to Britain was constantly attested to in church records. It was a subject of debate at various European church councils for centuries, with the English being able to claim an earlier church connection with the family of the royal twin boys, long before any at Rome. At the Council of Pisa in 1409, there was even an argument about whether Joseph of Arimathea or Mary Magdalene had come first to Britain. It was interesting to note that the Bethany group was never referred to as Christians, or even later, when the name was in common usage. They were called Celidei, or Colditch, which was angelicized to Coldes, as were other members of their group who arrived there some time later. The interpretation of the word Coldi was Essene initiates, or Christs, and the Bethany group subsequently founded a college of 12 holy Druids who came to be called Coldes, the word being purely of the Celto-British language. The Chaldee name was later attached to their first given name, such as Angus the Chaldee, and they were generally understood to be Celtic monks expounding a particular brand of esoteric knowledge. Some of the Chaldees traveled back and forth to various parts of Gaul, with Lazarus settling at Marseilles, and reputedly dying there early in the second half of the 1st century. A sister and friends of Lazarus were said to have progressed up the Rhone valley and established themselves at Lyons, but it was not thought necessary for the church to inquire why they should be found in France. The sister traveling with Lazarus was either Mary Magdalene, Martha, his full-blood sister, or Salome, his half-sister. The only record we possess of Lazarus beyond the Gospels is a very ancient British publication called Triads of Primitive Britain. It is difficult to explain how the name of Lazarus could find its way into these peculiarly British memorials, except by his presence in Britain. It was also interesting to observe that Irenaeus, one of the earliest church presbyters, went to southwestern Gaul before he began his orations at Lyons in France. The conclusion drawn is this: Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, and Martha were originally Britons who hastily returned home after supporting Judas Christus' uprising and then assisting with the fake crucifixion in Rome, with Princess Mary Magdalene was her husband, Rabbi Jesus Knubeline, his first wife, Princess Cyprus, and their 7 children, and the possibility exists that most of the children, if not all, were earlier born in Britain. It was recorded that Emperor Caligula banished Harold Antipas to Lyons, Gaul in 41, and although he permitted his wife, Herodes, Miriam Harold's sister, to return to her home, she chose to accompany her husband into exile. The Gospel stated that Herodias earlier had a daughter named Solomon to her uncle Harold Philip I, Mark 6:17. The Gospels also stated that Mary, Miriam Harold, the mother of Jesus, also had a daughter named Solomon to Philip. Professor Eisenman revealed that Philip in the Gospels is Harold. Therefore, either Herodias and Miriam Harold both had a daughter to Uncle Harold Philip and both named Solomon, or one of the Gospel narratives is incorrect. The whole Harold family, however, were now back together and generally based in southern France. Rabbi Jesus Knubeline's wives and children, and marital 8 years old, being some of the unnamed 12 others in the Bethany group. The recognitions of Clement, along with Joseph of Arimathea and Tryphomus, all went on to Britain. There they had a meeting with Mary Magdalene's father, King Cyprus, Tentvantius, who granted them 1,920 acres of land that was originally called the Sanctuary of the Christs. It was later renamed the Isle of the Christs, and then the Isle of Avalon. Today it is called Glastonbury, and there commenced the development of the British Church. The 12 Holy Druids. The documentation of events in Britain during the first half of the 1st century are so disconnected with the modern-day church presentation of the origin of Christianity that few realize the Roman Church was still centuries away from being established. 3 times the antiquity of the British Church was affirmed in ecclesiastical councils. The first, the Council of Pisa in 1417 AD, the second, the Council of Constance in 1419 AD, and the third, the Council of Siena in 1423 AD. It was stated that the British Church took precedence over all other churches, being founded by Joseph of Arimathea. For early information about Britain, historians are obligated to turn to Julius Caesar, Dio Cassius, Tacitus, Suetonius, and other later Roman writers, whom they too often accept as wholly accurate, forgetting that, in many cases, those writers viewed Britain through enemy Roman eyes. Julius Caesar's description of Britain as barbaric is often taken in the modern sense of the word, but to the Roman of the time, the word applied merely to all who were not Roman, in the same relationship as Gentiles to Jew. The available records revealed that Britain in those days possessed a highly developed civilization and culture, and excluding the warriors of war was anything but barbaric in the modern sense of the word. Diodorus Siculus, circa 14 AD, described the people of Britain as civilized and courteous to strangers. They are of much sincerity and integrity, far from the craft and connivery of men among us, contented with the plain and homely fare, and strangers to the excess and luxury of rich men. From other descriptions of the Britons, we read that their ordinary clothing was of tartan spun, colored and woven by themselves. The upper classes wore collars and bracelets of gold and necklaces of amber. The chiefs were armed with helmets, shields, and cuirasses of leather, bronze, or mail chains, while their many weapons of defense, darts, pikes, broadswords, were often richly worked and ornamented. This was the Britain with which Joseph of Arimathea was familiar, and where his name had become widely known. The Bethany group's connection with the development of the original British Church was recorded in the oldest of historic texts and was intermingled with a mass of unique earlier local traditions, maintaining Joseph of Arimathea lived a large part of his life in southern Britain. It was also said that he died there aged 76 and was buried at Glastonbury. Those traditions may be summarized and explained as follows. Joseph of Arimathea gained his wealth as an importer in the tin trade, and that operated between Cornwall and Phoenicia. The Phoenician territory consisted of an extensive coastal strip on the western seaboard of the Mediterranean from the tip of Mount Carmel to Sidon, 120 miles, and a hinterland of 20 miles stretching to the western slopes of the Galilean hills. Herodotus, 445 BC, referred to the existence of a long-established metal trade between Cornwall and Phoenicia and called the British Isles the Tin Islands, or Cassateriades. Pytheas, circa 352 to 323 BC, also mentioned the British tin trade, as did Polybius, circa 160 BC. Tin from Cornwall was also shipped around to Colchester and was used in minting British money. The oldest graves discovered in Cornwall at Harlan Bay, near Padstow, were believed to have been the earliest settlers, and some think the first tin workers. Associated with the mines of Cornwall was the mining of lead, copper, and other metals in the Mendips, which formed alloys with tin. An ancient pig of lead found in the area bore the stamp of Britannicus, the son of Roman Emperor Claudius, 10 BC to 54 AD, and established that mining of lead in the Cornwall area was being pursued in the first half of the 1st century. Diodorus Siculus also gave a detailed description of the trade, explaining that tin was mined on the mainland and then carried for shipping to an island called Ictus, or Mictus, joined to the mainland at low tide, which is generally held today to be Mount St. Michael in Cornwall. From there it was shipped across the channel, then called the Galician Gulf, to Morlaix in Brittany, and then transported overland down through France to Marseilles on pack horses. From Marseilles it was then reshipped to Phoenicia. The tin mines of Cornwall were the source of the world's supply in those days, and its export to Phoenicia provided the most suitable outlet for its use in the civilized Grecian world. Joseph of Arimathea should not be viewed as a lone figure on British shores in pursuit of his mining interests, but rather as a rich man of those days traveling with a considerable retinue and with entree to the royal court. By the testimony of ancient chronicles, he became the ancestor of a long line of British princes and princesses. His marriage to Miriam Harold produced Jose and Simon, and the name Jose or Josephus in some traditions appeared in several heraldic charts as the husband of a British princess. There was nothing recorded to indicate whether the high office of nobilis decurio was conferred upon Joseph by Pontius Pilate, or possibly one of the Roman emperors, for he lived in a time when honors were showed upon the families and friends of the leaders at every celebration. Church writings claim Joseph owned numerous fleets of fine ships, and that he lived at a menage in Britain that never paid geld or tax. Cardinal Baronius records supported a similar statement in the Domesday Book of 1086 that said the Glastonbury Church possesses in its own ville 12 hides of land which have never paid tax. One hide of land equaled 160 acres, and was deemed by the king sufficient to maintain a man and his family. The 12 Essene initiates among the Bethany group received one hide each, and subsequently founded a college or Celtic monastery of 12 holy Druids on the gifted land at Glastonbury. The date of 1086 was not the date of the writing of the Domesday Book, but represented the time in which King William collated a series of earlier writings into one book. The original record of the gift of land was first found referenced in a manuscript called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was created by King Alfred the Great in 871 and now preserved in the British Museum. The Domesday Book appeared to be a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that corroborated the original deed of the 12 hides of land and its tax-free grant. Of the gifted land, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle originally stated, "With this land grant, a document was furnished setting forth the legal aspect of the gift, which gave the recipients many British concessions, including right of citizenship and all the privileges accorded to the Druidic hierarchy. Every Druid was entitled to 1 hide of land, free of tax, freedom to pass unmolested from one district to another in time of war, and access to secret ceremonies at Stonehenge." The words of history recorded that the Essene initiates were joyously invested with all the privileges of Druidism by Druids of high rank who invited the Bethany group to British shores. Jesus adopted the Druidic wisdom. Upon the ceremonial acceptance of the land, Rabbi Jesus Knubelein forgave his rabbinic teachings and became a member of the sacred order of the Druidic priesthood. He was now symbolically regarded as twice born, or born again, into the Druidic life of elevated enlightenment that incorporated the sign of the sun. In many pre-Christian secret religious societies, it was customary to refer to initiates as phoenix, or men who had been born again after agreeing to accept a higher level of knowledge secretly passed down from the first custodians of divine revelation. The Druids had an entry level into their ranks consisting of 3 separate degrees of training through which their members were required to pass before being allowed access to the most secret religious mysteries. The few who passed the life-threatening 3rd degree were said to be born again and were then permitted to learn the ancient hidden teachings the Druidic priests had preserved from antiquity. By accepting the gifted land at Glastonbury, it seemed the 12 Christs were not required to undergo Druidic training, for they were already high initiates and became honorary holy Druids. It was said the Druid initiates enjoyed the special favor of the divinities and were thus worthy of the title twice born, for they had come to second birth from the womb of the mysteries and as such were considered truly evolved human beings. From these high-ranking initiates were chosen many of the dignitaries of the British religious and political world. The Druids had a Madonna with a child in her arms, and at dawn on the 25th day of December, the birth of the sun god was celebrated. Both the symbol of the cross and the serpent were sacred to the Druids. This very ancient born-again concept can now be found in the Gospel of John. "Unless a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." John 3:3. In the words of Rabbi Jesus Knubelein, a person was not considered twice born until he was initiated into higher levels of esoteric understanding. Druidism was regarded by the Romans as its greatest religious opponent, partly because its headquarters was Britain, and partly because of its very widespread influence opposed to Roman and Greek mythology. This influence might be summed up in the words of the historian Hume: "No religion has ever swayed the minds of men like the Druidic." In the time of Rabbi Jesus Knubelein, it could claim a past history of at least 2,000 years, and a familiar triad summarized its ancient principles. 3 duties of every man: worship God, be just to all men, die for your country. It was its religious tenets or philosophy that caused Druidism to be marked for destruction by an empire to universal dominion and to merge all nationalities in one city. the Roman political attitude towards it was evinced by the edicts of Augustus and Tiberius that clearly proclaimed to abolish Druidism, by making the exercise of the functions of a Druid priest a treasonable offense. The difficulty of admission into the Druidic order was on par with its privileges, and the barriers of admission threw the order almost entirely into the hands of the aristocracy, making it literally a royal priesthood. Kings, princes, and nobles largely made up its composition. The authority and influence of the Druids were very great, and overall, as popular as they were, great. The extreme penalty lodged in their hands, and the one most dreaded was that of excommunication, which was in fact a decree of expulsion from both worlds, present and future. The temples of the Druids were circular and obelisk, i.e., open above and on every side, representing in the form the dome of heaven, on which metal was not allowed to come. The altar in the Druidic circle was called cromlech, stone of adoration, and a nearby hollowed stone captured untouched holy water direct from the rain clouds. No Druidic service could be celebrated before sunrise or after sunset. The circular forms of the temples symbolized the eternal cycle of nature, and ceremonial avenues leading to and from the temples were sometimes 7 miles long. The national religious processions moved slowly through these on the 3 great festivals of the year. In the 1st century, the Druidic institutions were the largest in the world, both in size and in attendance. In Britain alone, they had a record number of 60 universities and over 60,000 enrolled students. When the great range of acquirements that the system included is understood, we can wonder why it required 20 years of time to fully master the circle of Druidic knowledge. Ancient Britain had acquired a stature with institutions of learning that rivaled those of today, and many elected to study there. Greek and Roman testimony stated that the noble and wealthy of Athens and Rome sent their children to study law, science, and religion in Britain. The determined efforts of the Roman Empire to overthrow its supremacy and, if possible, suppress it altogether, proved that its rulers had been made practically aware of this fact. King Jesus Cunubelan. When King Tenvantes died, Rabbi Jesus Cunubelan became king of Britain, and the pious domestic name then given to him was Bran the Blessed, Bran Fendigad. Bran originated from the word Bren line, the Bren line, Paidean oil, meaning from the line of the religious kings of all Britain. In the records of history, we therefore see applied to the gospel, Rabbi Jesus, the variant names of Tasciovanus, Cunubelan, and Bran the Blessed. King Bran the Blessed, Rabbi Jesus, as we shall continue to call him, had jurisdiction covering major parts of southern Britain, including the lower portions of Wales to the west and some portions of the east. This included Tri Novantum, and the pre-Latin version of this word was Troynovant, originally derived from New Troy, called London today. Just 50 miles to the northeast was Camulodium, now called Colchester. In 10 AD, Camulodium was reoccupied for the second time by a powerful group of Belgic people called the Catuvelium, and King Jesus Cunubelan was their ruler. It was here that he developed a mint, and by the year 42, the town had grown to 110 acres. The records of history are sparse in this period, but it seemed that a formidable sovereign fighting force was developed by King Rabbi Jesus and his sons, due maybe to the fact that Druidism was marked for destruction by the Roman emperors and invasion was anticipated. The brief 4-year reign of Emperor Tiberius' successor Caligula was not marked by any serious attempts of hostility towards the royal Druids in Britain. His projected expedition against them was viewed with extreme distaste by the soldiery. His camp in northern Europe was broken up, and they returned to Rome in false triumphant procession on Caligula's birthday, 31 August 40. To save face, he adopted the well-known phrase of Julius Caesar, saying, "Let us, my comrades, leave these Britons unmolested. To war beyond the bounds of nature is not courage, but impiety." Caligula was assassinated in 41 and was succeeded by Claudius, who reigned for 14 years. He was regarded as but one removed from an idiot. "He is as imbecile as my son Claudius," was the phrase his mother used when she wished to imply an extraordinary degree of stupidity. Claudius survived the violent reigns of 4 earlier Caesars, remained emperor for 14 years, and was thought by his contemporaries to be a fool. Tall and full in person, and possessed, when seated, of the external show of dignity, in motion his knees shook, his head perpetually trembled, his tongue stuttered, his laughter was outrageously violent, and his anger marked by profuse foaming at the mouth. He was married 4 times, and was subsequently poisoned by his last wife and niece, Agrippina. Increasing hostility towards the Druids marked the early years of Claudius' reign, and many fled to the ports, prepared to go forth to another land in search of freedom. In the year 42, Emperor Claudius strengthened the Roman resistance to Druidism with the issue of yet another edict, providing for invasion and destruction by force of arms of the Druidic chorii, or seminaries in Britain. In his edict, Claudius proclaimed in the Roman Senate that acceptance of the British Druidic faith was a capital offense punishable by death, and ordered the destruction of the institution and its libraries. The Romans had not previously held any special enmity to the British. Actually, and perhaps grudgingly, they had held the British in respect, but the edicts against the Druids were politically motivated. Association in commerce and culture had drawn them together for centuries, and it was not uncommon for the children of the nobility on both sides to seek education in the institutions of each. The British were a dominating problem. They were a warrior nation, skilled in the art of warfare on land and sea. Intelligent rulers and commanders, all of whom were steeped in the invincibility of the spirit created by the passion in their faith, guided them and declared that all men should be free. One of the earliest battle hymns of the Britons was, "Britons never shall be slaves."